Good evening, everyone. My name's Kevin Fuster, and I'm the current chairman of the Greenwich Society. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's Zoom lecture. I bet you're all grateful we're doing this online, as it's rather fresh outside, I think we might say. As you've just heard, tonight's talk is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Greenwich Society's website in coming days. The Greenwich Society is a leading local amenity society with over 800 members. Our mission is to be a strong voice for those who live and work in Greenwich. We strive to preserve and enhance the local environment, and we encourage the best of the new to improve the quality of life for our community. We organise through the Society a variety of events and activities, face-to-face and online. Plus, of course, we produce a wonderful bi-monthly newsletter, and I hope you've all got the latest one with the terrific Banks Christmas cartoon on the front. Tonight's speaker is Mick Delap. Mick, I'm sure, is well known to many of you. He's lived in Ashburnham Triangle for over 50 years and has been and remained very active in many local groups. Mick says he's happy to take questions after his talk tonight. And so if you do have questions, what we'd ask you to do when you think up your question during the talk is to use or press and use the chat button and then type in your question. And at the end of Mick's talk, our IT moderator extraordinaire, Jonathan Chandler, will moderate the question time. And thank you for that, Jonathan. So without further ado, may I welcome Mick Delap and invite Mick to address us all. Thank you, Mick. Oh, can everyone please mute their PC so that we don't get groans and moans and sniffles during the talk. So yeah, everyone should mute themselves, ready for Mick. Over to you, Mick.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Am I hearing and being heard and seen? It's always a miracle to me, but thanks very much for this opportunity. As you say, I've lived many years in Greenwich, and it's only relatively recently that I've really got fascinated by Deptford Creek, that bit of the creek which goes from the A2, the tidal bit of the Ravensbourne, down to the mouth at the Thames. It's always been rather shut away, and for much of my time in Greenwich, you couldn't see it, you couldn't walk by it, and I've come to realize that it's an enormous hidden asset. It's still not very easy to access, and is still rather hidden away. And I've become determined to try and find ways to open it up. And part of that is to encourage people to enjoy the history. So many thanks to the Greenwich Society and to Jonathan and to Jackie, and also to Helen McIntosh, who's been an enormous help in linking the work that a small group of us are doing, the CreekLink group, with the Greenwich Society. I should also say, it's a bit of a health warning, I'm actually not a historian. I was a radio journalist with the BBC World Service. I've done a lot of sailing. I've written a bit of poetry. I like telling stories. And that's, I think, why I feel that there is a story to be told about the creek. So let's start at the beginning. But before I do, actually, there's just one thing I want to point out. I'm not the historian. The historian is, let's see, I'm not managing to move on to the next slide. Henry? Oh, it's that one. Sorry, wrong button. I'm not the historian. I and many of the others of us owe an enormous amount of gratitude to people like particularly Mary Mills. And it just so happens that this is the cover of Mary's latest new book, which is just about to come out. It's on the industries of Deptford Creek. I've already raided it enormously, and I will raid it much more. So enormous thank you to people like Mary Mills, and particularly to Mary herself. Okay, where do we start? Well, the creek is an estuary. It goes into the main Thames. The actual creek from the A2 down to the mouth for many, many years, up until the beginning of the 19th century, was really basically just a swamp. As you can see from the 1787 map, there are osier beds, but the lower bit down by the Thames is entirely a swampy area. This is creek mouth in 1810. A small amount of piling and a few boats. One of them, interestingly, an early steamship. Here's the creek a bit later, another map with very little development along the creek, but one new arrival. The yellow line is where the map shows the Greenwich Railway, which in 1838 did actually reach Greenwich itself. It crossed the creek and reached Greenwich itself, but it was running through very rural country. Between here and London, it was out in the sticks. Let's look at the Thames now, the creek now. Here's the mouth of it, moving up to the railway bridge. That's the original. It's been worked on, but that's the original 1838 railway crossing, and that is one of the very few surviving Victorian works on the creek, which is a listed asset. And the picture on the right is looking down towards the Laban Centre, a Creekside Discovery Centre party are being given a tour of the creek, and interestingly, the creek is not muddy. It is a gravel bottom, and they are able to walk on it. The creek regeneration that we now see, the new high-rises going on, really got going in towards the end of the 1990s. And it started quite well. We got the Creekside Discovery Centre, we got the Laban Centre, and we were promised a pathway that would open up the creek on both sides. That has never happened. And in a way, that's my mission, to try and make some contribution to making it happen. Higher up the creek, to the other side of the Halfpenny Hatch Bridge, which was one of the other assets we got in that first wave of regeneration, is of course the Bazalgette sewage pumping station. Again, another listed asset, 3 different parts of it, the 2 engine houses and the coal sheds just down here on the right are all 19th century listed. And then if we go a bit further up, we get up towards the top of the creek. This is Maritime Greenwich, a new development beside the very wonderful Mumford's Mill. And we do, we'll get on to mills, because the mills have a very long history, the flour mills. But I think the first thing to say about the creek is, as you will see, the tide goes up and down, and that's absolutely critical for the history of the creek. It is at the mouth of the whole Ravensbourne, Quaggy, Pool series of rivers. And that guarantees that very frequently there is a rush of water coming down after heavy rain. and that wishes out the creek and keeps the mud from building up and silting up. And so the tides, the 5 or 6 meter tides that come up and down the Thames, flood the creek, flood the channel which the downrush of water has cleared, and enable barges to come up and down. The picture on the right is Robinson's Mill in the 1880s. And you'll see not just the dumb barges, the ones without masts, but there are actually a couple of Thames barges which have come up through the railway bridge and are servicing the mill. So tidal Thames, absolutely critical to tidal creek, absolutely critical to its development. Here are some later pictures. There's a rather wonderful aerial photo of Robinson's, and in the along the what's now the theatre arm, where people like Julian Kingston have their boats, there are a whole series of barges packed in. Here's a barge coming through the railway bridge. Didn't have to be opened for that barge because it's a dumb barge and didn't have a mast. And the tides continue to flow and the water continues to flood down the Ravensbourne. So it remains a navigable waterway. And the Thames Tunnel people, when they were building the Greenwich Connection Tunnel up from here to carry overflow water into the new super sewer rather than going into the Thames. When they were building that, they promised us that they would do their best to take at least 30% of the tunnel spoil out by barge rather than clogging up our roads with lorries. And in fact, they took 50% out. So the Thames the tideway operation shows that the creek still remains a very definite asset in terms of navigation. That was enormously helpful both for the steam mills. They were steam mills by this time. They had massive engines. They needed coal. And it was coal that enabled the creek to develop in the 19th century. Here it came in by Collier from the northeast coal fields. It was transferred into barges and carried wherever it was needed up and down the Thames. And one place that it was certainly carried was up the creek. You can see a stack barge in the background. That's bringing in another kind of fuel. That's bringing in straw and hay for London's horses. So here you have an undeveloped area quite near London. It's accessible by quite large ship at high tide, and it can provide an easy source of coal. And so you get the first of the major industrial innovations coming into the creek in 1824 and 1825. And this is down at the mouth of the creek, as it was then. It's a rather sanitized photograph. There's virtually no smoke. But what it shows is on the left, the Phoenix Gas Company. And they would have been producing a lot of smoke as they coked coal to produce gas. They were founded in 1825. It wasn't one of the first gas companies, but it was quite a pioneering one, and it was to have an enormous influence on the development of the creek. On the other side, on the west side, on the Deptford side, the General Steam Navigation Company, set up by the Brocklebank brothers in 1824, and that pioneered the use of steam in ships. first of all, paddle steamers. This is a paddle steamer, and then the creek was at the forefront of development of propeller rather than paddle propulsion. So 1824, 1825, the beginning of the industrial development of the creek. But not everything happened very quickly. The General Steam Navigation Company went from strength to strength. The Phoenix Gas Company also went from strength to strength. But by 1845, there's still not very much development up the creek. This purports to be the view from a balloon flying over the park up towards the, well, I don't know which way it's flying, actually. I don't know which way the wind's blowing. We should be able to see. Yeah, no, the wind is in the east, so from the chimneys. So the balloon is going upstream. But as you can see, the mouth of the creek, there is the Phoenix Gas Works. There is the where the General Steam Navigation Company's boats are. Sorry about that. Are being built and being engined and being looked after, but up the creek, very little happening. Still mainly open ground and virtually no building at all. The one thing that has happened between 1825 and 1845 is the Greenwich Railway. This is the line of the Greenwich Railway, and 1836 to Deptford, 1838 across the creek and to the Greenwich terminal. 1845 was also the year of the another major element in the creek. As industrialization was taking place, city populations were growing. There was a massive need for, and the general population was increasing. This was true all over the north, all over the global north, and in the States. And agricultural practice had shown how important fertilizer was for producing the necessary new quantities of food that were required. But the 19th century recourse for fertilizer was in trouble. Animal manure was useful, but it wasn't nearly enough. Fertilizer from deposits of seabird guano were being rapidly run down. It was known that things like phosphate had nitrogen available for fertilizer, but it couldn't be used by plants unless it was in some way made accessible to plant use. And in the 1840s, John Bennett Laws, who was based north of London, was a horticulturalist and an experimenter in horticultural matters, discovered that if you treated phosphate, which was readily available, with sulfuric acid or various kinds of acid, you could turn it into a super fertilizer. The fertilizers that from his discovery in the 1840s right through till now we have made heavy use of. So he patented the production, the way that he produced super fertilizer. And he was one of the innovators. The innovators on the creek were all technically brilliant, but some of them were appalling business people. Others were extremely good business people. John Bennett Laws was a terrific businessman. He tied up everything in patents. He prosecuted those who infringed his patents. And he also had a very good eye for where to put his first factory. And he chose the stretch of the creek just beside where the Laban Center is now. So that was after the first two innovations, the General Steam Navigation Company and the Phoenix Gas Company. The third big innovation is the John Bennett Laws super fertilizer factory. And that is, I think that can claim to be a world first. General Steam Navigation Company were certainly pioneering in the use of steam. Phoenix Gas Company was at the front end of the development of gas, but as Mary Mills's brilliant book on the Southeast London gas industry shows, they weren't particularly innovative. They were simply making sensible use. John Bennett Laws was a genuine world innovation and was quickly followed by manufacture of super fertilizer everywhere else. Next door to his factory, where the Laban Center is now, there had already been established a very successful soap factory, Wiens soap manufactory. And that was that played another strong role in the development of the creek. You'll notice that the road that runs just inside both Wiens factory and Laws Chemical Manure Works here is called Copperas Street. And that is one of the clues to why chemical industry innovation chose to operate in Greenwich, in Deptford Creek. Copperas was an early mechanism, an early process for taking iron pyrites, chunks of iron rock, and effectively sousing it, leaving it in water for several years, and gradually purifying the resulting fluid until you got effectively sulfuric acid, vitriol. That had started in a pioneering Copperas works in the 1650s, very early on. Another second works had followed in Greenwich. So through the 17th and into the 18th century, there had been interesting chemical activity going on in the Greenwich area. So that when 19th century chemical innovators were looking for where to place their factories, Greenwich was quite an obvious choice. Greenwich was also very attractive because it was handy for London, and yet it was relatively cheap land, mainly because it had been very swampy. It had only recently been piled. The pilings really only start developing in the 1820s, 1830s, and the wharves can develop from that purpose. So by 1841, around the time that Laws is starting up, the gasworks are pushing away, Wiens soap is producing. London had hit 1.6 million, 1 million in about 1815, 1820. By 1841, 1.6 million lots of opportunity there for innovation, for industrial innovation. And what you get developing as a kind of theme up the creek, there were all sorts of, as Mary Mills's book will show you when you read it, there were all sorts of very different kinds of manufactures, but there was a sort of thread. You got at the mouth of the creek, you got the General Steam Navigation Company and the Phoenix Gas Company. And those two produced a stream of associated development. The marine engineering that developed up the creek, I've marked with yellow, with blue rectangles. So you've got the General Steam Navigation Company down at the mouth. You've got John Penn, the remarkable John Penn, up not on the creek, not quite on the creek, but you've got other other engineering works going on, marine engineering work going on up and down the creek, including the Rennie brothers, the very innovative Rennie brothers, interested in iron shipbuilding, interested in propeller, replacing paddles with propellers and so on. And then you've got the results from the gasworks, because coking gas produces all sorts of chemical byproducts, mainly pretty noisome kinds of tars, kind of turpentines and so on. And you also get, coming from therefore from the gasworks, a whole host of chemical works which exploit the byproducts. I've marked the gas works with red rectangles, red squares. There's the Phoenix, sorry, doing it again. There's Phoenix up here. They've got an offshoot there. There's the another gasworks where the Creekside Discovery Centre now is there, and they are all producing various byproducts which clever businessmen and clever chemists can turn into all sorts of different things. So along Copperas Street, there is a whole series of different chemical works. That's Courtney Laws, John Bennett Laws. That's the Ween's soap factory, and then there's several others as well. So a strand developing in innovation. The other thing I forgot to mention was that, as well as marine engineering and as well as chemical works, there is also a need in London for public utilities. London desperately needs various ways of applying power. It desperately needs improved sewage works. It desperately needs protection against ever-prevalent fire. You've got so many coal fires burning that fire is a constant problem as London grows. So you also get a third strand, as well as the chemical activity, as well as the marine engineering activity. You also get public utilities. Here you've got the sewage works, the Greenwich pumping station produced by Bazalgette. Here you've got Merryweather's fire engines just down here, and up at the top you get, later on, you get a pioneering source of electrical power. So let's have a look at the first of those key public utilities, the London sewage system, which Joseph Bazalgette pioneered in the 1860s, 1850s rather. Until the 1850s, London was administered by on a parish basis, and it was therefore impossible to contemplate citywide solutions to the enormous problems that London's success and growth in population were causing. One of the main of these obviously was poor sewage distribution and resulting cholera from poor quality of water. The Metropolitan Board of Works was set up in 1856, but Joseph Bazalgette was its first chief engineer, and he was immediately entrusted by Parliament, which had to stop its sittings in 1858 in the summer because the smell from the sewage-laden Thames was so horrendous. He immediately put his attention to creating the London sewage system, interceptor sewers down both banks, running east towards Kent, relying on gravity flow to take all the sewage that they had intercepted, that had been simply running down the streams into the Thames, to take all that intercepted sewage down to Kent. But gravity ran out about Greenwich, and his great sewers, the various sewers that converged on Greenwich, needed to have a lift. They needed the sewage to be pumped up from the lower level sewers to a new higher level sewer, which would guarantee that it would have enough of a slope to get it out of London and into Crossness, where to start with, of course, it was simply pumped over and into the Thames. But that had ceased to be London's problem, and the tides could cope, more or less. So here is Bazalgette. Here is a look at his own plans for the Greenwich pumping station. You can see the enormous beam engine, which is going to be pumping up from the lower level sewer into the higher level sewer. And here is one of the one of the beam engines, not here, they've all gone. This is the one one of the ones in Crossness. And you'll note MB, the Metropolitan Board of Works, MBW, in beautiful enamel work. And that's the kind of beam engine that is being built here. You can see a bit of it here. 1851, 1861, 1862, 1863, the Greenwich pumping station is being built. It was the first of the pumping stations in the sewage system. And I like the picture of the workforce, because it's easy to concentrate on the entrepreneurs, on the Bazalgettes, on the Brocklebanks, on the John Bennett Laws, but there are so many other human stories associated with all of these works, with the building of them, the running of them. And when you set out a sort of set of headline descriptions of what's going on, there is so much more work which I think remains to be done. And people like Barry Taylor with the Deptford folk and the Deptford working people's gathering of those experiences of working in the Creek's industries. That is all, I think, something that I hope we can inspire new generations of historians to work on. At the same time, there was a great need for improved marine propulsion, both for the kind of commercial traffic that the General Steam Navigation Company was running, passenger ferries up and down the Thames for a day out in Southend or Margate, but also cargo carrying, and going increasingly far away. But at the same time, of course, in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, British naval power was expanding. The Navy was switching over from sail, rather reluctantly at times, but was switching over from sail to steam, and was constantly looking for improved ways of powering its increasingly large steam capital ships. So John Penn, there were three John Penns, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, were pioneering constructors. There were many constructors. They weren't by any means the only ones, but they were pioneering innovators in powerful engines. 1860, the Navy's first iron capital ship, HMS Warrior, powered by John Penn engines, built in the works where the Wicks factory is now, Wicks shop is now, and Pets R Us, shamefully unrecorded as the remarkable operation it was for 60 or 70 years. And here we have a picture of the works. You can see the scale of operation. Here's an engine, that's the engine of the Warrior, and that would have been manufactured there. The boilers would have been constructed down in Deptford. It would all have been rolled down to the creek, some of it to be taken off and installed in the Warrior, where she was being built further up the Thames. Where's it gone? Where's it gone? So by the 1860s, the creek is beginning to be much fuller, where those earlier pictures saw osier fields, swamp. You've now got factories all up and down the creek, because London has presented an enormous opportunity. London has gone on growing. It's the world's mega city. It's up to 2.6 million, and there are enormous opportunities for business entrepreneurs, and they are flooding into the creek. Why the creek? It's cheap, it's handy for London, it's quite trendy. From ever since the Greenwich Railway, the first London railway, was opened in 1838, Greenwich became quite trendy, and so entrepreneurs would have been aware of Greenwich as a possibility. It also had quite a good workforce from the Royal Dockyards, from John Penn's and so on, for taking part in the new any new activities which were being funded. Another of the public utilities that came to Greenwich was Merryweather's fire engine makers. They had started up in Longacre in London. I think there's a picture of their Longacre. Yes, there's their Longacre there. Sorry. There's their Longacre works, but they needed more space, and in the 1870s they came down to Greenwich and set up a major factory there, making their again pioneering horse-drawn steam-powered fire engines. You can see on the left they're proving, I don't know whether there was a fire in Canterbury Cathedral or whether they're just proving that they could do it, but there's a jet flying over Canterbury Cathedral, and they became a major element in the creek. This is from the Greenwich High Road side. You can see the large works. You can see a fire engine being demonstrated. And the combination of successful enterprise, but also the public utilities managing to solve many of the problems of London as a megacity, problems of fire, problems of poor sanitation, and so on, meant that the population actually went on growing even faster. And by 1881, we're up to 4 million. And that presents an enormous opportunity for startups. Going back to the chemical side of things, one of the least well-known but most remarkable chemical entrepreneurs, and he did actually then get into iron shipbuilding as well, was a man called Frank Hills. He was a good chemist, but he was an even better businessman. He had a large family, brothers who followed in his wake, and he produced a whole series of chemical entrepreneurial. Sorry, am I? Are we all right? Is that causing a problem? No, I think we're all right now.
It stopped now, but I'm trying to make sure everyone's muted.
Yeah. Okay. So Frank Hills, Mary Mills's wonderful book about the Southeast London gas industry goes a little into Frank Hills, and I hope we're going to be seeing more from Mary about him. He was a bit of an Elon Musk figure. He was a playboy as well, and he played around for a while in the 1840s with steam transport, and that's one of his steam transport vehicles. About 40 years later, this is a little sidetrack, but it was made actually on the creek. One of the employees in Merryweather's, Edward Butler, who lived in the Ashburnham Triangle on Ashburnham Grove, Edward Butler started playing around with the newly emerging petrol engines. And he actually produced what has a very good claim to be the world's first working road vehicle powered by an internal combustion engine. He patented it the year before Carl Benz patented his, and he took it out on the British roads. Unfortunately, British law required A, that he couldn't go very fast, B, that he had to have somebody waving a red flag in front and somebody following behind to apply the brakes if his own brakes failed. So it wasn't much fun. Also, his employer, Merryweather's, relied on horses to pull their steam fire engines, and they complained vociferously that his very loud velocycle was literally frightening the horses. Nobody else was prepared to pick up the idea, and it was eventually broken up. So another sort of world first, but it didn't get anyone very far. One last piece of public utility that did get very far was Sebastian Ferranti's power generating innovations. Electricity. In the 1870s and early 1880s, it was possible to generate small amounts of electricity, and a number of London stores and theatres did install generators, but they were only installing a very low amount of voltage, 600 or 700 volts at the most. It could only be spread a very short distance, a few hundred yards from the actual generator. Along comes Sebastian Ferranti, a very young electrical engineer, but he reckons that you can generate enormous quantities of electricity. And if you use alternating current, you can actually also disperse it, spread it around by high tension wires. He persuades a group of backers to back him and form the London Electricity Supply Corporation. And he chooses Deptford Strand, just beyond the mouth of the, just upstream of the mouth of the creek, for his power station. And he builds his power station. It comes on stream in 1891. He is required by law, or the law setting it up, permitting it, requires it to deliver some public good. So he says, okay, we will use my new ability to transfer power some distance by running a cable over the creek and into Greenwich High Road, and we will provide electrical lighting for Greenwich High Road via a substation. The substation is just by the mouth of the Greenwich pumping station, the Greenwich sewage station. It's still visible. It still has the, it's not the original pumping station. It was a late distribution station. It was built later on the same site, we think, but it's the only surviving bit of building that has the London Electricity Supply Corporation initials on it. So that's the last of the great creek innovations. And in the 20th century, life goes on. I'll just round off very quickly. Life goes on. The General Steam Navigation Company continues to repair and ships and run a whole series of shipping lines, both passenger and commercial. The Ferranti power stations, there are 3 of them by now, churning out power and employing plenty of people. The steam mills, Bumfords and Robinsons up at the top of the creek continue as well. Here's a picture of the very impressive Robinsons flour mill. You can see the kind of scale of flour production that we're talking about. Here's a rather nice picture, again, big story somewhere there, of in 1957 staff and a list of the staff. But it's literally, excuse the pun, it's running out of steam. Manufacturers have been so successful, they need more room than is available in Greenwich Creek. And Greenwich Creek enters a fairly significant decline. There's a lot of scrap metal where the Laban Centre is now. Lewisham was exporting, or Southeast London was exporting rubbish. And sadly, the old standbys of Greenwich Creek, of the Creek industrialization, the flour mills and the Ferranti generating station, both run into trouble. The Robinsons burns in the 1970s and goes completely out of business. And by 1992, the Deptford power stations are all redundant, and the last one, the chimney, is blown up. You'll see a picture of John Major desperately hoping for re-election in the foreground, and in the background, Dockside is falling apart. And that allows us to start regeneration. And you get Docklands regeneration up and down the Thames, and you get not just housing, you get what had formerly been closed off Docklands areas opening up. You get the Thames Path, you can walk up and down the Thames, you can cycle up and down the Thames. You get the Waterlink Way, where you can go through Brookmill Park and up the watercourse of the Ravensbourne. But the creek remains shut. It is supposed to operate. It's supposed to, the planning authorities say that they're going to build a path alongside the creek on both sides, but it doesn't happen. What we do get, we get the Creekside Discovery Centre, brilliant. We get Halfpenny Hatch Bridge, we get the Laban Centre, but that's about all we get. Some of the new housing that is built in the 2010s and is still being built does provide creek access, but a lot of it doesn't, even though it's supposed to by its planning permissions. And so there is still a battle to be fought to try and open up the creek in the way that other parts of Docklands have been opened up. As we look at the creek, we also need to think of a few other things. Just very briefly, the source of the investment in 19th century industrial innovation is coming out of an 18th century which had seen an enormous transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north, partly through the operation of the Atlantic slave trade and the sugar economy based on enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, partly from the removal of great wealth from South Asia and India by the global north, including Britain. So that's one context in which to think of what we think of as the great success of the creek development. The other context to think of it is that it was fossil fuel based, and it was the beginning of the process by which overexploitation of fossil fuels has led to the climate emergency. So although we hail those remarkable industrial innovators for the success, for the influence they had on the growth of the British economy, we also need to be aware that the 21st century creek is facing, as we all are, a climate emergency. The top red line is the rise in CO2 emissions rocketing up and showing no signs of stopping rocketing up. My granddaughter Dodie will be my age in 2098, and it's going to be a very interesting question as to what kind of world those of us my age and those of us younger than me leave to children like her. One of the contributions that I and a small group of colleagues want to make to this process is to try and open up the creek. And we have set up a small organization called CreekLink, supported by the Greenwich Industrial History Society, the Greenwich Society, and the Ashburnham Triangle. We have commissioned a feasibility study to show what might be possible, even if there isn't a pathway up and down the creek. There are a number of places where you can now access the creek. And using those places, we want to try and create a heritage trail which will tell the story that I've told and look ahead also to the creek as it faces the crises that the 21st century is bringing. Here is where we want to put our information points with their storyboards. They start at the mouth of the creek on the west side, on the west bank. Number 2 is Union Wharf, essential living. which is one of the developers who has opened up a creekside access. We would like to put one at the Laban Centre by their riverside. We haven't approached them yet, and we hope we will soon. The fourth one will be on the Halfpenny Hatch, just by the Creekside Discovery Centre, telling the story of the Creekside Discovery Centre. And also each of the boards, we will ask the Creekside Discovery Centre to devote a small section to the ecology and the environment of the creek. So each board will also not be telling just a historical story, but it will be looking at the creek as it is now in ecological terms and looking ahead to where it might go. Number 5 is on the edge of the Greenwich, the Bazalgette sewage pumping station, on the creek, on the Halfpenny Hatch Bridge, and we hope to put three boards there because the Bazalgette system is such a fantastic story, both now and as it has rejuvenated itself with the new super sewer. We want to put the last 3. The 7th one will be at the head of the creek in maritime Greenwich, just by Mumford's Mill, telling the stories of the mills. Number 6 will be at the mouth of, at the entrance to the Greenwich pumping station, and will tell the story also of the London Electricity Supply Company. And number 8 will, we hope, be at Hilton's Wharf, if they will let us in. We're in negotiation with them. And number 9 will be just by the little road that runs along the south side of Waitrose. And with those, we hope that we can provide a kind of walkway which will tell stories, will provide a way of accessing the creek, and will provide a way of introducing more people to both the amenity that it could provide and also to the history that it could provide. That's a mock-up of the kind of board that we will use. We are using the Madeleine Adams, who designed the Blackheath boards, and she provided she prepared our feasibility study. And if we get the charitable funding which we are looking for, Heritage Lottery Fund and so on, she will design, manufacture, and or will look after the design, manufacture, and installation of the boards. As you will see, the little purpley bit, the magenta bit down in the right-hand corner, is natural history, is ecology, and that's what we will be looking to the commissioning the Creekside Discovery Centre to provide on each of these boards. And that is our last page on the feasibility study. It is available on the CreekLink website. We are very keen to work with the Greenwich Society in taking this forward, and we do. Helen McIntosh has already been a great help, and we do need for the next year, as we seek to make our charitable applications, we do need anyone who is interested in this kind of thing to step forward and help us. You can reach us via creeklink.co.uk. So many thanks, and over to Jonathan for any questions.
Thank you very much, Mick. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and there's just one question listed at the moment. Would Nigel Duncan like to unmute himself and ask his question about the tides up the creek?
Thanks, Jonathan. Can I check? Can people hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mick. Thanks for that. That was great. And I know we've talked a bit about this before. That's so much more information. One of the things I'm curious about is how high, when we have a really high tide coming in, does the tide reach up the Ravensbourne? I mean, the reason I ask is I was I was walking in the park up there once and saw what seemed to be quite a high tide sort of coming upstream. So it seemed to me that it was coming up there, unless something was causing something odd to happen. Do you know?
No, it is happening twice a day quite normally.
So it goes. So it goes right. How far up does it go altogether?
Well, the fully tidal rise and fall stops at the A2 bridge, but some salt water is pushed further up. It doesn't rise and fall to the extent that you get below the bridge, so it's not enough to allow barge traffic, for instance, up, but it very definitely raises the water in and right up. I think I've seen it affected right up as far as Elverson Road DLR station.
Yeah, this is where I was in Brookwells Park.
Yeah,
I saw
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Okay, great.
And the other effect you get, which is the same effect in bigger scale you get on the full Thames, if you get a combination of a high tide, which effectively slows the water flooding down the river, and a very heavy rainfall, so that there is a very heightened amount of water coming down the river, you then get a much higher rise within the actual river system, backing up quite a long way. And when you see the in Brookmill Park, the water being really high, it's probably a combination of a heavy rainfall coming down and a high tide blocking off the excess, that water from leaving the system.
Great, thanks very much, Mick.
Thank you very much. Philip Binns has a question. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, Philip?
Thanks very much, Mick. That was a brilliant talk. I'm interested about the opening up of the paths on the south side of the creek, and in particular when the Thames Tideway people have finished using their site at the side of the pumping station, whether or not Thames Water have given any indication of there being a possibility of getting access to the coaling sheds, for instance.
It's a very tangled story. The planning consents that Tideway were granted in 2013 did give some encouragement to the possibility of a creekside pathway, but they weren't mandatory. And subsequently, in spite of considerable campaigning by me and by others, asking for opening up, particularly for the listed coal sheds, which are sitting idle, are listed buildings sitting idle, fairly unique in industrial 19th century industrial history, and a terrible wasted resource. But Thames Water, who are the owners of the site and who will take it back totally under their control once the Tideway tunnelling is finished, are adamant that because it is a high security building, no public access can be permitted to it. They are becoming more open to occasional use. They are becoming slightly more open to engaging with the public, only slightly more, but the whole area of the Greenwich pumping station is going to remain almost entirely out of public use. That's why the storyboards that we want to use to tell the story, the absolutely marvelous story of the Bazalgette pumping station, of the coal sheds, and of the 21st century super sewer, we are going to have to site just outside on that pathway, on the C10 pathway that comes over the Halfpenny Hatch. And it's a great shame, and we're very sorry about it. But we have perhaps slightly as to soften the blow, both Tideway and Thames Water have agreed to fund one of our boards, but they will have to be sited outside the pumping station.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks again.
Thank you. Jackie Robinson had a question.
Oh, thank you. It was a fascinating talk, really interesting, lovely images. Thank you. I have some memory of a Radio for Wildlife program, and it's probably some years ago now, which always tickled me. We were talking about the unique wildlife habitats that are being created in Deptford Creek by the old supermarket trolleys that they'd found there. And I think there were some particular little prawns or something that were nestling in there, and they were having to take the supermarket trolleys out and replace them with wicker baskets to replicate it, which I thought was rather fun. So what I was curious about was really where we're at. Have you got any information about the way that the cleanliness of the water or the state of the tideways in terms of natural habitat, and will your storyboards be reflecting any of that the rejuvenation, perhaps, hopefully?
Yes,
I have this
yes.
fantasy that things may still recover or get better.
Yeah. We are in awe of the work of the Creekside Discovery Centre, and we want to work very closely with them. They obviously are monitoring carefully the state of the creek. They keep a list of both plants and animals, both maritime and above water. And I honestly can't tell you whether they feel the creek is improving or not. What I can tell you is that they have an immense list of both plants and birds and marine organisms, and they are very proud of the work they do in creating a more fruitful sort of way of fringing the creek, and we very much want to support the work that they do. And every one of our boards we are going to ask them to, in the place where it is, to pick out a number of aspects of the creek ecology.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. I've got one more comment on the chat box from Julian Kingston. Would Julian like to make the point to the listeners?
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Julian,
Great.
Lovely to see you.
Same, great stuff as usual, Mick, really good. I see that the dreaded spell check has actually corrected the spelling on one of the words in my question, but it was more a remark than a question, in that a few years ago now there was a thing called a charrette held at the Laban Centre, and it was a sort of high pressure brainstorming session for things that could be done on the creek and ideas to change before the developers really got their teeth into it. And there were quite a few good ideas about access, but the one that always appealed to me was to suspend pedestrian ways and cycleways either side of the underside of the Docklands Light Railway, so that you could zoom over the top of the creek and see it from above. But in a way, the Docklands Light Railway does that at a couple of points, because certainly when you come into Deptford Bridge Station, you can look back at the top of the creek. And when you come from Greenwich Station up on the DLR, you catch glimpses of it. And I think it's quite nice to catch glimpses of the creek rather than to have it absolutely sort of, thrown under your nose, so to speak.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that it's possible. The charrette was a wonderful consultation and produced great ideas which have largely, sadly, been ignored. But we're very much following in your footsteps, Julian, in a way. Where we can get a peek at the creek, that's where we're putting our boards. So it is dipping in and out. But I think if you can have a coherent path that goes from the top of the creek to the bottom of the creek on both sides, that will encourage people not just to go randomly, but to explore with some intent. And I'm hoping that the Waterlink Way on the Lewisham side will develop. I hope that your community on Theatre Arm will also be served by new accesses to the creek.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're hopefully we'll survive.
We very much hope so.
Been there long enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Julian. Mary Mills would like to have a word.
Yes, very, very briefly. Vic, I mean, all you're saying about the coal economy and so on, which I think is important, but we've got to remember that before there was a water-powered economy. And because I've taken the book, as you know, up to Lewisham, because there's so many very important sites between Deptford Bridge and Lewisham, the nationally important site being the Tudor Armoury Mill, which, of course, in its entire history, to when it became the Royal Small Arms Factory, was water-powered. And others were, I mean, you've got this very, very important old tide mill on the creek, which is probably pre-conquest and lasts until Robinson takes it over and is water-powered throughout. And we have to remember that these rivers, I mean, it's not just the Ravensbourne, but also in the Wandle and the Darrant, provided vast amounts of power through water. And I won't go on about the tide mills as well, but I think it's something that needs to be looked at. And I'll shut up, but thank you anyway.
Well, we all owe you, Mary, enormous thanks, and looking forward enormously to the book.
It is available. It's available from today.
From today, well,
it's on the Amazon website for sale, and I hope it's all paid because I haven't seen the proof.
Well, we will be rushing out to get it. And thanks very much. But yes, the water, I mean, it always amazes me how much water in flood comes down the Ravensbourne. There's a lot of water, and it is absolutely critical in flushing out the system and you know, keeping that gravel from being silted up.
I don't know if you've read, I mean, all about, because I don't think that what we know is the Ravensbourne now is actually the Ravensbourne. It's an artificial river. And somebody you won't know called Malcolm Tucker says he thinks it's a reservoir which was built for a very early medieval mill, and that we've turned it into the river, and the real river has disappeared. So the Thames was on the real river.
Read Mary's book.
Thank you very much, Mick. Those are all the questions that have been submitted. So unless there are any more, I'll hand back to Kevin to bring things to a conclusion. If you'd like to unmute, Kevin. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Mick, for a very, very enlightening talk. And thank you, Mary. At the end, it's interesting. At the very end, we're told that we're actually not looking at what was actually the river. It's sort of like an exclamation mark at the very end of the talk. More to look at. So thank you, everyone who's attended, who's sat in on this. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And finally, can I thank Jonathan for his masterly oversight of all the IT issues. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
My pleasure. Good night, everybody.
Good night.